The content you're about to watch was previously unreleased and only available to our Patreon, Spotify, and YouTube supporters. We're making it available now so that you can get a teaser of what you can get every week if you support us on Patreon, Spotify, or YouTube. Stand by. This episode is supported by our Dirtle Maniacs, who enjoy ad-free content as well as bonus content that can be found either on Patreon, Spotify, or YouTube. If you're thinking about supporting the show, we'd really appreciate it, and you can find us on any of those mediums. What it do? ABC Deckbuilding.
Next on Eternal Dirtles.
Hello, and welcome to Extra Dirtles, your bonus content for the week. Obviously, we have Phil Bleckman here with me. I'm Zach Clark. A little more casual than our normal episodes. This one we wanted to talk about ABC deck building. Phil's sort of synthesis of how he builds his decks, and I think that getting like a quick 15-minute layman's guide, like a bridged version of this would be really interesting, and maybe we can use some current legacy decks as well and try to explain ABC deck building through those as well. So Phil, I think the best way to start this is by giving your synopsis of what ABC deck building is.
Yeah, ABC deck building is just a way to theorycraft your deck building in a way that lets you filter better card choices to actually achieve the strategy that you're looking to achieve, and also help you identify ways that you're supposed to mulligan, how you're supposed to navigate sequencing throughout a game, and what matters in a matchup. And so it just sort of gives you a blueprint, like a mental foundation for how to navigate games with the deck that you built. That way you don't get lost in the sauce or confused as to why your deck isn't operating the way it should. It just really filters your card choices all the way down. So you can identify why you're choosing a card, for where it slots in, for what part of the structure of ABC deck building that it's helping.
Yeah, so in synopsis, you could say that this is a form of theory crafting that not only is important for brewing purposes, teaching you how to build your deck better, right? But it also helps you win matches. It teaches you how to play the game better as well.
Yeah. So when we talk about ABC deck building, the first thing to identify is the legacy power level thing to do. That's your A
That's your
part
A,
of
yeah.
ABC deck building, and that can change from matchup to matchup. It can change from game to game, depending on how you've built your deck. So obviously in the blind, it's pretty easy to figure out what your plan A should be. But when you're playing a certain matchup, for example, I'm a Terminus guy, and Terminus is my legacy power level thing to do. But there's plenty of matchups that don't care about Wrath style effects or white removal, right? In which case, my plan A has to change. And I take that into consideration when I'm building my deck, and then I also take that into consideration when I'm playing out that match. And knowing clearly what your A, your B, and your C are in your foundation as you build your deck can then help you move around. And then when you do your matchup spread, go, okay, this is my ABC for this matchup. And then, I think when a lot of times when I hear somebody's like, yeah, you want to take the time to master a deck, I often think it's these type of things where you know the theory and why you built the deck the way you built it, the card choices that you did behind it, the sequencing of when you how to navigate those tight and difficult situations, and then to further that, it's then knowing where in each matchup how to actually leverage that understanding and knowledge of deck building theory.
Yeah. So I think that's an interesting point is taking the sideboard situation, right? When you move into games 2 and 3, let's say, Miracles versus Storm. Immediately, your legacy power level thing to do, obviously, is not Terminus or Swords to Plowshares. It becomes Counterbalance?
Right. So, I mean, the initial theory that I came up with this, and this was inspired to me by Sam Rukas when he was teaching me how to better understand Miracles way back in the day during Top Miracles. And the quintessential foundation for Top Miracles and why it was such a clean and consistent deck was Terminus was the legacy power level thing to do. Therefore, you enabled that by playing Sensei's Divining Top, and then Counterbalance was enabled by playing Top. So
that's your A, your B, and your C right there.
Right. But against something where Terminus is not a legacy power level thing to do in a specific matchup, then you shift your pieces around. So something like if Counterbalance becomes the A plan because you really want that, again, that you're going, I'm playing Counterbalance, which is enabled by Sensei's Divining Top, and then your C can be whatever, like a variety of different things that hopefully are enabled by Sensei's Top as well, to help you bridge the gap between your theory, so everything can be fluid. But it just depends on the matchup, your card choices, the
I don't
rest
think
of
they existed at the same time, but you could, if they did, your C could be playing fetch lands with Mystic Sanctuary.
Right. So like they never existed at the same time. Top and Sanctuary never existed together. But yes, that like in the world now, essentially I play Terminus, therefore I want Mystic Sanctuary, therefore I want Counterbalance. Mystic Sanctuary is sort of like filled in that gap and of Sensei's Divining Top, but the difficulty of that is it's slower, right? Like Mystic Sanctuary doesn't come on turn 4, and so it goes into an additional layer of theory for me, at least, where I have to figure out how to enable the first turns to get to Mystic Sanctuary and to build along that. So it needs additional infrastructure, which is why it's a weaker deck, right?
Yeah. So just to like, really coalesce it into like the smallest possible like takeaway, right? It's A is the legacy power level thing to do. B is the enabler. C is what is enabled.
Yes. Yeah, that's like a really simple way to just calibrate it all down. And that's not always going to be clear cut, right? Like, not every deck is going to be like that. Usually
we were talking about that with the Bean Pack deck.
Yeah, and I just want to caveat that some people might get like confused on some things. Some decks are front loaded one way or the other, depending on what it is. But like, it's helpful to be able to have a baseline to at least identify from. So yeah you've been playing Guild Pact Draco Beanstalk for a while, and we just had a conversation where you were like, okay, well, I want Beanstalk, therefore I want Draco, therefore Guild Pact, right? And it's that's why being able to suss out Beanstalk is overly powerful, right? It's a clear power outlier.
Yeah, it is the power level thing to do, of course.
Right. And some decks might do that, but Draco Bean Pact, I don't think, is in that same structure. I would argue that Draco Bean Pact is building around Leyline of the Guild Pact. That is what you're considering to be the legacy power level thing to do. Therefore, you want Draco and Leyline binding and all that, and then therefore you want, as your C, you want Beanstalk.
Yeah.
So then when you're prioritizing your mulligan decisions, right, and that's where it's important to think like how you're mulliganing and why having the proper structure is helpful, and knowing where the proper structure actually lines up and being honest with what your deck's actually trying to do, even given the context of like how those cards might be in other decks, right? Beanstalk might be the A for other decks, but for Leyline Beanstalk, Draco.deck, it's really like you're opening your hand, and your best hands are going to have the Guild Pact in it, not necessarily the Beanstalk in it. Right.
Yeah. And I think when, anybody who watches me on Twitch, when I'm making those mulligan decisions for that deck specifically, because I've been playing a lot of it lately on Twitch, that's a lot of what we discuss is like, I'm never like looking at a hand and being like, oh, it's got a Beanstalk in it, I'm keeping, like if I see a hand that has Leyline of the Guild Pact in it, I'm much more likely to keep. And then I talk about why or why not, like I talk about like, okay, like, this hand looks good. It's got Beanstalk, right? But it doesn't have like X, Y, and Z. I think we can do better. And then on Mulligan, I'll be like, okay, this has Guild Pact in it, and it's got a Draco, and it's got like a follow-up beyond that, and maybe has some interaction too, or, draw spell or something. And so, yeah, most of the decisions I end up making in that deck are based around the fact that like I want all 5 of my colors, and I want Draco to be a 5-color creature.
Yeah. Right, exactly. That's
whereas like a like a Sultai deck would just be like, I just want to go to Value Town off of my Beanstalk.
Yeah, and there's so like a good example too of like, let's say you wanted to think like, okay, Beanstalk is the legacy power level thing to do. Even though I personally dislike the decks because I feel like they're a bit inflexible. But if you looked at any of like the old Yorion builds of old with Beanstalk, that's like a nice little example of Beanstalk is the legacy power level thing to do. Therefore, I want Yorion. Therefore, I want insert whatever is an ETB trigger that draws a card that is then, enabled by Yorion, right? Like you get the additional value off that. And so then you're playing all of the cards that essentially are ETB cantrip, and you're playing a volume game because that's what is enabled by Yorion. But then you get to play Yorion because Beanstalk is leveling that up, right? It not necessarily the best version of Beanstalk, but like a good way to see the template of difference between like Yorion Beanstalk and how that ABC is a lot different from Draco Beanstalk, and that ABC, right? And
So-
and why they feel like different decks, even though they're playing a lot of the same cards.
So let's take a couple different, well played legacy decks that are like in the meta right now, and ABC them down, right? I mean, as untimely as this will be later on when someone's looking at it, let's start with the Scaminator.
Yeah. So I mean, if you think, okay, if Grief is like the legacy power level thing to do, right? I've turned 0 strip. Like let's put it through different lenses. Let's say it's Grief, right? If we want Grief, therefore we want Reanimate. Therefore we want like the Reanimate package of Entomb Atraxa, right?
Yeah.
So and the reason that deck is really powerful in a quintessential way for ABC is that all of that happens on the first turn, right? Like you can essentially do everything that deck is built and designed to do in the first turn and a half cycle, right?
Yeah.
Which is very different from any of the other decks we talked about that, you may not get to your C plan until mid game, right? You're ideally performing your plan A, the legacy power level thing to do in the dark within the first 4 turns. That's like your goal should be that like in the dark I'm able to do whatever I want. So like for me, when I'm playing Counterbalance Miracles, I'm like, okay, well, if I always have to assume that Terminus is live in the dark, and so I'm always going to cantrip, either looking for counterbalance or for a way to actually convert a Terminus in the first couple of turns. And like that's how I navigate my games in the blind until I'm presented new information. So for Scaminator, it's like, okay, well, I'm going to open Grief, and then I want to like scam you, right? Because that's the thing. So I mean, if you think of like the Sensei's defining top of Scaminator is Reanimate.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and that's actually why I chose that deck first, because it's such a clear ABC plan. Like it's super obvious, right? You want to grief people. If you want to grief people, you want to play Reanimate. If you want to play Reanimate, you might as well be playing Entomb and Atraxa and other Reanimate targets. It's like ABC is no more clear than that in that deck. I think that's the clearest, like, obvious this is ABC, and everyone knows the deck at this point and can see it, But let's talk about a deck like 8-Cast.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so 8-Cast has a couple of different options for it. Let's say the legacy, like you've played a lot more 8-Cast. What do you think the ABC is when you're playing it? How do you think about 8-Cast?
Well, I guess 8-Cast. So you want to talk about the legacy power level thing to do is playing cards that cost more than 1 mana, right? Like you're playing, you're skipping the mana curve. So Ancient Tomb, right, would be your legacy power level thing to do, right?
So I'll flag there, right? Because the legacy power level thing to do is not often an enabler.
Yeah, this is true.
And
okay,
right, because if you were like, what does your deck do? You wouldn't say, oh, my deck does Ancient Tomb.
Yeah,
my deck Ancient Tombs you, right? That can mean a whole swath of different things, but that's because Ancient Tomb is the enabler of the legacy power level thing, right? Mm-hmm. So a legacy power level thing can exist only because Ancient Tomb exists, right? Like without Ancient Tomb, it may not exist, but the fact that it can. So Ancient Tomb.
I guess then it would be Patchwork Automaton would be the legacy power level thing to do.
You could argue that it's Patchwork Automaton. You could argue any of your threats that you're thinking is your plan A. You could argue that it's Emery, right?
Yeah.
Like you could argue that it's Urza's Saga.
If
anything,
Saga,
I would say I would argue that Urza's Saga is probably the most powerful thing. And you're like, how do I make the most powerful version of Urza's Saga that I can? In which case, if you were like, my legacy power level thing to do is Urza's Saga, so I want Urza's Saga, therefore I want Ancient Tomb, therefore I want literally the rest of the deck.
Yeah.
Right?
So everything else that's in the deck, 1 mana artifacts that get fetched off of it. Chalice of the Void. If you were to
argue the other way, another similar thing of if you're thinking, remember, it's what is the legacy power level thing? B is what enables the legacy power level thing, and then C is what is enabled by B. So, for example, let's say you're like the legacy power level thing to do is Emery. Therefore, I want all these 0 mana baubles, right? Mm-hmm. And then what is enabled by me playing all these 0 mana baubles? Well, Urza Saga constructs look really good.
Yeah. Patchwork
Automaton looks really good. Cannoneer looks really good. Yeah. Right? Like those are all those are things that are all enabled by what your enabler is for your legacy power level thing. Now you can even argue the other way, and this is why this theory is fluid depending on the matchup. Some matchups, Kappa Cannoneer is your best threat, right? Like if you're like, I can just stick a Kappa Cannoneer, like protected or whatever, but if I stick a Kappa Cannoneer, I'm likely to win this game, right? Yeah. And so you might open your hand and go, okay, well, I know in this matchup the legacy power level thing to do is Kappa Cannoneer. So if I open Kappa Cannoneer plus land plus a bunch of 0-mana artifacts, now we're off to the races, right? But the way that you can view that lens in ABC theory is, okay, the legacy power level thing to do in this matchup is Cannoneer. Therefore, the thing that enables Cannoneer is all of these 0-mana artifacts for improvise. And then C would be like some things like Emery or Urza Saga, or the things on the back end that are enabled by the 0-mana artifacts.
Got it.
Right? So depending on how you're viewing the matchup, that's how you can identify what your legacy power level thing is, and that's when you can look at a hand and go, okay, I had Kappa Cannoneer and Urza Saga and Emery, and like looking at it, if you have all these tools here, you go, well, I have all these different options available to me. How am I supposed to navigate which one is the optimal one in the matchup? Well, if you know the legacy power level thing to do in the matchup, then you can prioritize your sequencing in a way that will help you leverage more percentage points in that matchup. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. All right. One more.
Also, to just qualify right there, with like a deck that has all that fluidity for being able to maneuver around through ABC deck building, that's also a representation of why a deck is really good.
Yes,
right?
Exactly.
If you can do that reasonably in all these different matchups, it becomes a lot harder to hate out because your opponent can go, well, I need to stop that power level thing to do. And you're like, well, I can move into this power level thing to do and then navigate it that way. And
if you've ever felt like the other side of that, then you know that you're playing against a very good deck.
Right. Like if you bring in hate for a deck and then you like are going, wow, my hate didn't do anything.
Yeah.
It's because that deck is powerful enough to be fluid to get around all of that. But it's also on the pilot to recognize how to navigate towards the legacy power level thing to do in that matchup. Right.
Yeah. All right. One final one. And then if you comment below, we'll talk about some other ones in the comments. Let's go over Delver, right? Like that's a deck a lot of people play. Let's talk about Delver's ABC plan.
Yeah. And this is all like, foundationally, it's like pick your threat, right? Let's say it's like DRC, legacy power level thing to do, right? I want DRC, therefore I want Days, therefore I want Wasteland. Really easy, right? Nice clean ABC. Usually that's just slotted in with cheap threat, therefore Days, therefore Wasteland, right? Because if you can protect that cheap threat and then use that disruption to maintain that cheap threat to protect the queen, that's just like a really quintessential strategy. And if you think about how clean that is, that's all achievable on the first turn and a half cycle in the same way that Scaminator is, which is why it's very good, right? Like if you looked at what we were just talking about, any of those things, it's like, okay, I want Emery, therefore I want the artifacts, therefore I want C, or I want Urza Saga, therefore I want Ancient Tomb, therefore I want C. Those things all are at least a turn cycle in, where a Delver pilot can go, I have opened my plan A with B all the way through because does that make sense? Right?
Yeah. So you're saying that it's threat, Days, and then C is Wasteland?
Yeah. So if you think, what is the legacy power level thing to do? That's the thing that your deck does, which is I play a cheap, powerful threat. And then what enables that cheap, powerful threat? Well, Days enables that cheap, powerful threat to like the fact that it is cheap and is uncosted, that I can maintain it as a power level thing is because I have this cheap countermeasure.
Yeah, you're protecting the queen, sure.
Yeah. It's like if you played your 1-mana threat that was going to get you some amount of damage or value, but I could just point a removal spell at it, then it's nowhere near as good, right? It couldn't necessarily be a legacy power level thing to do. It would just make an exchange, right? Yeah. Like if you think about 1-mana threats differently, like you have Emery, but like when we think about how the impact and power level of Emery versus the impact and power level of DRC has never been in a deck without Days, right?
Yeah, I don't think so.
And if it is,
unless you're Nate and you're playing Mardu,
but then you can also think about it in the way where, let's say you were playing like black red, dot deck. You just cut the blue from Grixis Delver, right? Mm-hmm. The DRC on one is exceptionally less powerful, right?
Yes, agreed.
Yeah, and that's if you think like power level thing enables the power level thing. What is enabled by B? Then you have something like DRC, and DRC's power level is accentuated by Days, and Wasteland is further enabled by Days, right?
Yeah.
Like the fact that your opponent has to play at, like we've talked about this before, and it's why Daze is so good. But because your opponent has to play low to the ground and compressed, Wasteland is then enabled by Wasteland without Daze is a lot worse than Wasteland, or Wasteland with Daze is a lot better than Wasteland without Daze, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah. And so in a lot of shells, if you think the Wasteland decks that are not like Wasteland recursive decks, which is a whole different strat, but like let's say you were playing against Maverick or playing against Jund or playing against some other deck that just has Wastelands, but it doesn't have Daze. Those Wastelands feel a lot less powerful.
Yeah. Agreed. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's we try and keep these to be about 15 minutes long. We're a little over, which is fine. Hey, I want to once again thank you all, everyone here that's watching is supporting us right now, and we really appreciate that. Again, thanks so much for that, and we will catch you next time. If you have any comments or you want to see a deck done in the ABC style, like we break it down, please comment below. And that's it for us. Thanks so much. Before you go, I need some help. Please subscribe to this channel and do your part to help sustain the legacy content ecosystem. Just subscribing to this channel goes a long way to reminding YouTube that people love and support this format. Now, if you really want to go the extra mile, you should think about supporting us through Patreon. Both the links for subscription and Patreon are right here. And if you're listening on an audio format, you can go to patreon.com/eternaldurdles. Thanks so much for watching.